Yeah, so thanks ever so much for coming. It's always very good to know that when you're in a competitive situation for people to come to your talk, that people actually turn up. So I'm hugely relieved that you've all come. So thank you ever so much for that, and I hope I can live up to your trust in me. I've got mixed up with CDKN, so it's a very roundabout route, and I wanted to give a story around technology diffusion. So I spoke very briefly before on the stage that I had I guess a past in financial services, one which had rather a shocking outcome for me, because after leaving financial services, flushed with bonuses, trying to put money into developing countries, I accidentally made more money by putting money into developing countries. And to me that felt completely and utterly wrong. So really out of embarrassment, I then tried to change policies to ensure that policies are more effective. And that if there are more effective policies, there are less and less, I guess, opportunities for perhaps taking money into the wrong purses, into the wrong wallets when you're transferring technology. So I want to describe that experience for a number of different organisations and experiences I've had, and hopefully that will give you some insight into how I think it's probably best to learn from doing things on the ground, rather than just to do things from top down, always have policy without understanding what's really happening. So I think I'd like to start by talking about technology diffusion and technology diffusion in Africa. So whilst my experience has traditionally been very much working with transferring funds through the Europe, US and Asian markets, the developing world was very new to me as well. About 10 years ago I escaped from banking and then sort of moved into the venture capital world, and then started getting more and more involved in Africa. Now, I think I'd like to start by saying that this is just one experience here. So what I was trying to do here was trying to take corporate funds, which in fact, I don't really find it that hard to raise funds to get money for developing countries. I don't think that's a controversial statement. I think it's that there's lots and lots of corporates, lots of foundations that want to put money into developing countries. As long as your proposition is tight, as long as you can show some measure of success and that your money will be used in the right way, it's not particularly hard to find significant funds to put into developing countries, in my experience. Now, I'm talking here around probably a fund of around £10 million, which went probably disastrously wrong. So raising the funds was relatively easy, but actually getting effective action on the ground was very, very, very hard. So if we take Africa, then going down into, if this was live with the internet, obviously we'd zoom in with Google Maps to one village down in Kenya. And in Kenya, there's a particular problem, as many of you will know, that they have a lot of stoves which are very, very harmful, a lot of emissions created through the burning of wood. And they have the 3 stones, technology. So 3 stones, as you can see there on the slide, in which they put on their cooking. So the reason for showing this slide is that the complexity here is how do we get technologies that we're developing in the north, in the developed countries, to be effective in countries such as Africa. So all this weight of technology experience we've got, how can we get this so wrong by going in there and putting in a stove which perhaps is more effective? Well, we can do that very, very easily. Now, we can quite easily go in and set up factories. This is obviously a picture of a factory in Africa where we're creating stoves. In this situation, this factory is now creating 350 stoves a day. So this is an amazing sort of development. And the end product provides you with a stove like this. This is the end product. So going from the 3 stones to this. So this is the technology development that was taking place in this village in Africa. Now, when this first happened, going in sort of flush with bonuses, a bunch of do-gooder Westerners going into Africa, trying to do the right sort of things, an awful lot of mistakes were made. Now, you can make many mistakes. One of the first mistakes is if you see the height of the stove, the first stoves we put in were completely the wrong height. So culturally, they couldn't use the stoves, they were completely the wrong height. So they were totally useless. The second waves of stoves we put in were built out of bricks. After a few months, those bricks were taken away and they were used to build houses, so the stoves completely went away. So just 2 examples of trying to put in a technology by do-gooder Westerner funds can be absolutely disastrous. And to do it right, you have to understand what happens on the ground. Now, technology can be in very, very different shapes and forms. Now, I've just described a very, very simple technology here, from going from 3 stones to an effective lower carbon type of carbon stove, which is a very important activity in Africa and very, very clearly in India. Now, if we take a different analogy, now trying to do this in the developed world, we have all our wonderful sites. I think this might be the Ferrer site up in York. We're developing lots of wonderful technologies. So, for example, here we've just got an image here of some equipment involved around the carbon capture technologies, which is now a major requirement in the developed world. Now, two analogies here, completely different technologies. So governments are trying to put hundreds of billions probably, to enable effective technology transfer. So governments have to look at both the cook stove situation and carbon capture technologies. Two fundamentally different types of technologies, but that's the sort of scope that we're trying to get involved with in terms of effective diffusion. Now, each of these technology outcomes have very, very different objectives for the user. So here we have a villager quoting that the stoves enabled her to spend more time looking after her children. So it's a fundamentally different objective and outcome to perhaps the UK Office of Carbon Capture and Storage, which are very interested with getting on with what's probably internationally politically the correct thing to do. So different technologies and different objectives and different outcomes are expected by different stakeholders, which clearly means that it's going to be very difficult to have a one-fits-all type of policy. Now, my own work involved with universities now, having left the financial world 10 years ago, has been twofold. Firstly, I'm involved with a centre which creates lots and lots of new technologies. This is just very representative that a university, we're involved in a whole load of new technologies. And this is just an example of perhaps 4 universities doing an awful lot of work in bioenergy, creating plants which can give you food and fuel, to creating carbon capture technologies, to creating recycled products. Now, these are the sort of technologies which we have to sort of evolve and find effective ways of diffusion into developing countries. And we can get even more complex than that by making an economy with specific, focus on China, so to rebalance the economy, obviously firstly to a communist society, but also where we're no longer going through the linear approach of make, use and dump, but more to the approach of make, use and recycle. So an awful lot of technology development is taking place. We're not in any, situation where we can't create these technologies. They're in abundance, and universities are very good at it. What they're very bad at is making it quite effective when it's actually used on the ground. It's very, very easy to get it wrong. I've already spoken about the issue around something as simple as getting the stove height completely wrong. So understanding the culture of the country is very, very important. But also, it's very interesting to note, we recently did a survey, one of my colleagues actually up at Leeds University, talking with a business group of around 800 businesses or so. And do you know, the interesting fact is that only 25% of leading boards are actually interested in making radical progress towards climate change, which is rather scary. Now, if you're trying to take that from a developed country, and these companies, because they responded to the survey, have probably more empathy with climate change and reducing emissions. Now, if we've got very low willingness to take risk in developed countries, it's going to be very, very difficult to take that risk to be brought into developing countries. Which really brings us down to the situation that policies have to be effective. Now, all of the studies that are done, many of the studies which you have read, probably many of the studies that you're involved with, will say that low carbon technology is the answer and essential to addressing long-term climate change. But I think the real question around this is how do we effectively do this? And is this a question of R&D investment by governments or a question of market incentives to promote private sector investment? I think it's probably a combination of these two things. It's certainly an experience that I've had. Now, we know that technology is a very, very complex process, and an awful lot of us are relying on the market pull, but the market pull creates a major conflict in innovative risk-taking. And I think that probably it's good to note that the importance of cultivating domestic markets is absolutely paramount. So really the point of my talk today is to say that by having effective policies alone is not enough. You really have to understand how to work domestically. If you are going to put in new technologies, you fundamentally have to know what's happening on the ground. So the talks of having a 100 billion green fund alone is not effective. Having proceeds from perhaps auctioning in the European emissions trading alone is not enough. We need policies to help those technology diffusions be effective in the countries where they are effectively going to be diffused. And whilst our challenge is to invest absolutely trillions of dollars, this has to be done through initiating, I think, flagship projects and incentivising investment. And hopefully some of these things we'll be talking about in this group over the next 2 or 3 days. So just to bring us back to the technology issue, there's loads and loads and loads of different technologies which we have. An awful lot of these technologies are very, very effective in developing countries. So we have those technologies and we have to try and find a way to transfer those. There's a huge amount of problems with diffusing these technologies and a huge different amount of different outcomes. So those outcomes can be very, very complex or as simple as this. You know, a carbon stove, which is far more effective, enables the women to spend more of their time with the children, and which itself has many, many co-benefits and to the village as well. So that was the brunt of my discussion. Hopefully that was of some interest to you. I'm currently doing work through 2 academic groups. We've got a group which is around 150 academics, which is originally based out of University of Cambridge. I got together with an economist from Cambridge and Oxford, and we set up in Cambridge a number of years ago. We've now got 150 academics around the world. I would say 100 of those are in developing countries, which is great. And we do an awful lot of work advising governments on effective climate policies and climate strategies. We've also got another academic group, which is a number of universities, and it's up to 9 universities involved on carbon capture technologies. And again, these universities are very interested in the exploitation of those technologies to the emerging economies themselves. I also do some philanthropic work through a smaller group with these cook stoves in Africa, and also part of a group which does a lot of major funding for microgeneration projects in India as well. So my life is constantly filled with trying to overcome these challenges.